The events of the night of Pesach, the Seder, are described in the Mishnah. The Mishnah in Tractate Pesachim gives us instructions about how to conduct the Seder. The word Seder means order, and at the Seder we have an ordered set of events. In the most basic way, what is being ordered is the meal, that which we eat, which in the Torah is a sacrificial meal, and today is a vestige of that sacrificial meal, and what we say. What we say meaning what we study. In the section we call Magid, from the word Haggadah, and then our prayers of thanksgiving, the Hallel, which we begin before the meal and conclude after the meal with other auxiliary prayers. The core text of the Magid, of the Haggadah, is instructed by the Mishnah. Mishnah tells us that we are to read the parasha of Arami Oved Avi, V'doresh Kol HaParasha Kula. We are to read the portion of the wandering Aramean in the book of Deuteronomy and conduct midrash on the parasha. It's a rare instance where the Mishnah actually instructs us to do midrash. The choice of this particular portion is odd for two reasons. First of all, this comes from the book of Deuteronomy, towards the end of the book of Deuteronomy, and not from the book of Exodus. One would expect that on the night of celebrating the Exodus, we would read from the book of Exodus, which we do not. Secondly, the section Arami Oved Avi is the prayer of the pilgrim who brings the first fruits to the temple. The bringing of the first fruits, the Bikurim, is an event that takes place on the holiday of Shavuot, which the Torah calls Yom HaBikurim. Why then do we choose this portion to be read at the Seder on the holiday of Passover? Even stranger is that the dirashot that we say and study at the Seder, which often take the form of citing a second verse to explain the first verse, more than half of the second verses that we cite in the very drasha of Arami Oved Avi comes from the book of Exodus. So it seems awfully strange to choose a text in Deuteronomy and explicate it by a set of verses from the book of Exodus. In my own Haggadah that I wrote together with Rachel first, I devote 2 chapters to this question and suggest a whole variety of answers. The listener is urged to read those 2 chapters in Seyul Lamad in the Haggadah that we co-authored. But I'll mention one point right now about Arami Oved Avi. At the Seder, we are eating and we are studying. When one opens up the Torah and sees what the Torah says about Passover, the Torah calls the 14th day of the month Chag HaPesach and describes the bringing of the Paschal sacrifice, and that night the sacrifice is eaten by members of the family. The Torah also speaks in several places about children asking questions, sometimes in the future, about various things, including the Passover ritual. It is not at all clear, actually, in the Torah, certainly for most of these verses, that this questioning takes place at the very same time we eat the Passover sacrifice. But the rabbinic understanding is that the two things come together. The study, the explanation, the questions take place at the very same time we are partaking of the Passover sacrifice. Where do we have a model for this? That when we bring a sacrifice, it's accompanied by a story, or by a study. And the answer is there is one such instance in the Bible, and that is the bringing of the first fruits. The first fruits are brought to the priest in the temple, in the place that God has chosen. They are taken in a basket and placed down before the altar. So the first fruits are not simply a gift to the priest, they have a sacrificial cast. In conjunction with this sacrifice of the first fruits, the one bringing the sacrifice makes a recitation, which begins with the words, Arami Oved Avi. And the recitation is not just a recitation. The recitation is actually a story, because in the wandering Aramean passage, the pilgrim is speaking to somebody. The pilgrim brings the fruits to the priest, so presumably addresses the priest. But the Torah also says, V'yanita v'yamarta l'fnei Hashem Elokecha, you should speak up and say before God. The portion concludes by the pilgrim saying, V'ata heveti et beshit pri adama asher natatu li Hashem. I bring the first fruits that God you have given me. So the person speaking, the speaker, has multiple audiences. Both speaks before God and before the priest. So it's not just a question of remembering, because memory you can do yourself. It's a question of telling a story. And the story is accompanied by gestures. The pilgrim bows down at the end. The pilgrim has a basket. The pilgrim places the basket before the altar. So there's not just the telling, there's what accompanies the telling. And most importantly, when the pilgrim speaks, the pilgrim says, in the first verse, my father was a wandering Aramean, but continues, Vayareu otanu hamitzrim vayanunu, the Egyptians harmed us. The pilgrim says us. It may have happened many years ago, but in the moment of storytelling, at that point in time in which the pilgrim mentions the suffering, the pilgrim has fully identified with those who suffer. They harmed us. We cried out to God in the next verse, and God brought us out of Egypt. So those that constructed the Seder, beginning with the Mishnah, perhaps before the Mishnah, and up to and including the anonymous compiler, redactor, composer of the Passover Haggadah, these elements are central to the Haggadah. It is a story. And because there's an audience, it's a conversation, it can never be the same story. And it's not just what you say, it's the visual objects that accompany the Seder, the Pesach, the Matzah, and the Marar. And most importantly, we put ourselves in that place. We assume the role. The Egyptians harmed us. We cried out. God has delivered us, not just our ancestors. Towards the end of Maggid we say, we are so grateful to God who redeemed them and redeemed us. Avotenu votanu. Otanu hotzi misham, we were taken out of Egypt. So the Arami Oved Avi, the first fruits, are really the perfect model for what our tradition has instructed us to do at the Seder. To think, to study, to question, to identify, to engage, and to see our tradition as a living part of who we are today and where we want to go. Have a Chag Kasher v'Sameach.